If you're curious about how to paint a Ghibli scene or want to improve your gouache paintings, here I'll be going through my techniques, thoughts and process in detail as I paint this scene from Totoro. A bit of background first, I have studied design up to a university level, but I haven't had any proper painting lessons before, so I may not be using the right terms as I go through this. I am still learning, but I wanted to share with you what I've learned so far through the past few years of using gouache. If you're new to gouache, I do have another video explaining the basics of gouache if you want to watch that first, then watch this as more of a live demo after. All the materials I'm using will be listed in the description area, so you'll find that there. So let's begin. We'll start by prepping our painting surface. I like to use cold pressed watercolour paper for gouache, as it does a good job at holding water and I prefer textured paper. The washi tape will give you a nice neat finish, and if you want to be really neat, then draw out a grid first with pencil to guide you. If you stick the actual paper down to the surface, it'll stop the paper from warping so much, and I like to stick it to a board because then you can move it around if need. So I used masking tape on the outside simply because it covers a wider area and is cheaper than washi tape. Masking tape is very sticky though, so I do recommend reducing the stickiness by taping it onto your hand, then peeling it off before sticking it onto paper. This way it's less likely that the tape will tear or damage the paper when you peel it off later. Washi tape is more gentle, so you can just stick it down straight away. I actually find it really distracting when I film and work at the same time, as the camera blocks my vision a bit, so apologies, but I didn't film much of the sketching process. I'm using a mix of yellow ochre and raw sienna for my underpainting, which is diluted quite a lot and applied with a synthetic brush. With gouache, you should use synthetic brushes as it holds less water than natural brushes. The paint is easier to work with a touch of water, but typically you don't want to dilute it too much. The idea of doing an underpainting is to give this piece a warm undertone, but it's actually my first time doing an underpainting like this, so I'm just testing as I go along. The best thing about doing an underpainting is that you have a value to measure against. To put it another way, it is really hard to judge how dark or light your colours are when painting straight onto white. Since I started with the ground first, which is a really light colour, it was so much easier to judge how light it was against the yellow background. I'm using Memory Gouache for this piece. It's not my favourite brand to use, but I've had this set for quite a while now, so I just want to finish it. And out of watercolours, acrylics and gouache, gouache is by far my favourite media to work with. It's really great and versatile to use. It can be as opaque or watered down as you like, and you can work into it using wet on dry techniques. Also, you can easily reactivate dried gouache with water, so there's less waste and you don't need to rush yourself when you paint. I'm not sure if it's just me, but I often find the start of a painting quite daunting because there's a lot of information to process. I was actually quite worried about doing this painting as I underestimated how detailed it was. When you look closely, there's so many greens, textures, and all layered really intricately. And once I started the grassy background and realised how long this piece would take me, I did consider scrapping it and looking for something easier. But I realised, as with my YouTube channel, the progress might be really slow, but it's just something I need to persist with. A way to make the painting feel more manageable to me was to complete small sections at a time. I would typically work in layers and do all the detailing at the end, but I wanted to see if I had the capacity and patience for this first. I had initially thought that I could finish the painting in 2 days, but that was incredibly optimistic because it actually took me about a week and a half to finish. So seeing the painting come together in small parts made it feel a little bit more achievable. A great thing about gouache is that it's very forgiving to work with. Because it can be very opaque, you can easily cover up mistakes or rework an area. What you don't see so much on camera is that I often repaint areas because the colours or textures just weren't quite right. I never want to be too hesitant when I paint, so even if I'm unsure, I'll rather get the paint down first, then correct it later if need. It's a lot easier for me to just improve something than to work with nothing. To get the colours to blend together better, I use the wet on dry technique, and it helps if you dilute the colour more and work into it gradually. I didn't quite get this on camera, but that's why some areas look smoother than they did as we jump through this video. Up until this point, I've tried to get my colours similar to the original, but not to an exact match, simply because it's quite tricky and really time consuming to do. But for the sake of this video, I wanted to see how closely I can match the blue of Totoro. If you want a detailed video on how I mix my colours, please comment colour mixing below and I'll do a video focused on that. But here's a quick colour matching guide. If you haven't done so already, you should do a colour swatch sheet for every brand of paint you use. Now, using that as a guide, see which colour resembles the subject the most. The colours on camera look slightly different to real life, so it's the ultramarine that's closest, but we'll just need some mixing. Also, it's a lighter blue we need, so I added white to check again. Colours do look different depending on what colour is next to it, so you should paint to the edge in order to check it accurately side by side with your reference. Now it's just trial and error, so I begin by adding Prussian blue and kept testing. You need to do this gradually, which is something that I didn't do, as later I had to add in more ultramarine blue. And the thing about colour mixing is you just need to experiment a bit. So I was curious about what would happen if I added a bit of scarlet to it, but it made it a bit too grey. Also, when you experiment like this, do take a small sample of the base colour and mix these separately. You don't want to keep mixing in the same batch or you'll just end up wasting a lot of paint. I then wondered what cerulean would do, but it turned out to be too bright. So really the main colours were white, ultramarine and Prussian blue, which I carried on adjusting and testing. Another thing to bear in mind is that the brand you use will affect the results. I know that the Memory brand isn't as saturated as the Arteza brand, so my colours wouldn't be as vibrant. Also, you're comparing paint to a computer printout, so there's other things to consider. My printer ink was running low at the time, so the colours here are quite patchy, and this isn't something I'll be replicating in my painting. This is about close enough. Counting the swatches, it took me about 20 attempts and somewhere between 1 to 2 hours to get to this point, which is why I don't colour match every colour or the painting would take me 10 times as long to finish. Painting onto the yellow background would alter the colour too, but that's okay as it's consistent with the rest of the painting. I don't know if this counts as cheating, but I had no interest in trying to paint on the black outline. Using a fine liner would guarantee a fairly consistent line width, and I wasn't ready to ruin about 30 to 40 hours worth of work at this point. I guess my point is that you should do what's best for you to achieve the results you want. When a good 70% of the painting is complete, that's when it starts to feel really good because you can see it coming together. Now that the painting doesn't feel so overwhelming, I can start being extra attentive to the details, like how these leaves have about 3 different colours in them. At this point, you do also notice how a lot of areas aren't quite right, but it really doesn't matter too much. I would just retouch certain areas, especially shadows and highlights, because those things would make a difference. Honestly, I feel really proud of myself, mostly for persisting and finishing this, but also seeing how much I've improved when I compare it to my Ghibli paintings from 2-3 years ago. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts as it does get quite lonely on here, so do drop me a comment or any questions and I'll be sure to reply. And if you made it this far, you can encourage me by subscribing, liking and sharing this video. Thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next time.